Shalom Hadavarniks. Welcome to our next session of the 12 Minor Prophets. We're now entering a study in the book of Zephaniah. This is session 34 of the study of the Minor Prophets. And we're going through Ariel Ministries material, Ariel's exegetical outline notes and the Minor Prophets, developed by Dr. Arnold G. Fruchtenbaum. Now you can obtain your copy of the Zephaniah class notes, the outline, in PDF form from the Hadavar website, and you can also download some handouts that I've given in the past to students from the website as well. So feel free to pick up that material. I'll be referring to that material as we go through this study. All right, let's dive into the book of Zephaniah. We begin with the introduction in chapter 1, verse 1. The word of the Lord which came to Zephaniah, son of Cushi, son of Gedaliah, son of Amariah, son of Hezekiah, in the days of Josiah, son of Ammon, king of Judah. Well, we learn the name of our prophet, Zephaniah. His name means he whom the Lord hides, or the Lord has hidden. It could also be translated, God has treasured, or God treasures, something like that. This will become important when we get to chapter 2, verse 3. Well, what do we know about his family? Well, he's a unique prophet in that he lists 4 generations of his family background. His family tree. His father, Cushi, then his grandfather, Gedaliah, then his great-grandfather, Amariah, and his great-great-grandfather, Hezekiah. Now, he's unique, like I said, because he's the only prophet to go back 4 generations. Most don't even mention their father. Daniel, Amos, Obadiah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Haggai, Malachi. None of them mention their father. Some do mention the father: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Joel, Jonah. Zechariah happens to mention his father and his grandfather, but Zephaniah goes back an additional generation. He goes back 4 generations. Why? Well, the reason is Hezekiah. The Hezekiah there is King Hezekiah, good King Hezekiah. He's one of the most godly kings of the nation of Judah. So Zephaniah appears to be of royal descent, a Davidic prince. Well, what's the date of his ministry? Well, the revelation came in the days of Josiah, we learned, and so that's around 640 to 610. So more than likely, 640 to 610 is a wider view of things, but a more narrow view would be 630 to 626, during or near the time of Josiah's revival. So he's a contemporary of Nahum and Habakkuk. So let's take a look at our period of the writing prophets chart once more, and you can see the writing prophets. The period of the writing prophets is 845 to 424, something like that. We've already looked at all the earlier prophets in the writing period. Now we're in the prophets in the middle of the period, and we're looking at Zephaniah. So he is a contemporary of Nahum and Habakkuk. Then the end of the period we'll see Haggai, Zechariah, and finally we'll study Malachi as the last prophet of this period, the last minor prophet. So here's our prophetic period and the position of Zephaniah in that period, about the middle of the period. Okay, where did he minister? Well, the locale would be Judah for sure, and Jerusalem most likely, very possibly, because he's a member of the royal household, and he's also familiar with Jerusalem's geography. He mentions specific areas of the city, which we'll see later on in our study. All right, what was the historical setting of Zephaniah's ministry? Well, it's a time of royal revival after the excesses of evil King Manasseh. Manasseh was really bad. His reign can be studied in 2 Kings 21, verses 1 through 18, 2 Kings 21, verses 1 through 18, and 2 Chronicles 33, verses 1 through 20. 2 Chronicles 33, verses 1 through 20. So again, a bad king. But there was corruption in the royal house in spite of Josiah, good King Josiah, and his reforms. And you can study Josiah's reign in 2 Kings chapter 22 and 23, and 2 Chronicles chapter 34 and 35. So again, the reign of good King Josiah, 2 Kings chapter 22 and 23, and 2 Chronicles chapters 34 and 35. Now, religious syncretism was rampant in Judah at this time. Now, what is syncretism? Well, here's an official definition from dictionary.com. Syncretism, the attempted reconciliation or union of different or opposing principles, practices, or parties, as in philosophy or religion. Now, put it another way, combining many religious ideas into one religion, even if they are contradictory. And that's what was happening. The many religions of the Middle East were being all lumped into the worship of the Lord. It would be pseudo worship of the Lord, really. Now, as far as the historical setting goes, in politics, the Assyrians were in decline. Still a strong political force, but they had not yet been defeated by the Babylonians. So the Assyrians are still on the horizon, although not the threat that they used to be. So the major points. First of all, we look at the judgment of God. Zephaniah talks about the judgment of God. You know, God does not tolerate sin forever. He's a very, very patient person. And many people take advantage of that patience. But we must be reminded, he does not tolerate sin forever. He draws a line in the sand. And when we finally step across that line, judgment or discipline comes. Also, Zephaniah talks about the universality of judgment. The entire world stands guilty before him. Not just the Jewish people, but the entire world. He also mentions the severity and goodness of God. By that I mean he judges, but he also rescues. You know, he judges, but that doesn't mean he's not good. God is good even in judgment, because a good God could not ignore unrighteousness. If he did, he wouldn't be a good God. Just like a good judge could not ignore crimes. A judge who just let murderers get away with murder would not be a good judge. So God does judge, and that does not compromise his goodness. But remember, he also rescues. And Zephaniah also points out the necessity of warning. And warning is that issue that always indicates love and mercy. Why? Because warning always allows for repentance. It allows time for people to change their mind and step back over the line and avoid the judgment. So the theme of Zephaniah's book is the day of the Lord, just like Joel. Now let's take a look at the prophetic time frames of Zephaniah. Let's start with just the generic time frames I've told you about. Prophets sometimes look at the distant past, but they very often look at their own present time and then make near predictions of the near future. Some prophets cover the prophecies of the first coming. They cover prophecies about the tribulation. They deal with the second coming, and they deal with the kingdom. Now that's kind of the generic time frames. Now Zephaniah is a little different than that. In Zephaniah's work, we'll see him start out not starting in his present time, but speaking about his present time. He'll talk about the near future. He won't say anything about the first coming, no first coming prophecies in Zephaniah. He will talk about a period that I call the first regathering, and we'll talk about that when we get there in chapter 1. And he talks about the tribulation period. He does not specifically talk about the second coming, other than to touch on it in the kingdom. So the prophet's present time, the near future, the first regathering, the tribulation, and the kingdom. That's Zephaniah's time frames. All right, as far as that goes, now he starts in the future. He starts dealing with the tribulation. It's a kind of a horrifying start to the book. So we start with the tribulation period in chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. Now the theme of the book is the day of the Lord, and that's chapter 1, verse 2 through chapter 3, verse 8. But we start out in verses 2 and 3 dealing with the universality of judgment. And this, by the way, is a Ne'um Adonai. It's a solemn, sure pronouncement of God. It's going to happen. You can bet your retirement on it. It is going to happen. So what's the first thing that's going to happen? Well, all things will be consumed in verse 2. I will completely remove, literally, sweep away all things from the face of the earth, declares the Lord. Well, the picture here is God using his broom and he's going to sweep away what's on the earth. Now, some of translations, of course, translate the idea as completely remove, and that carries the idea here. Sweep away is a little more picturesque, as in the Tanakh and other versions. So God is taking his broom, and he's going to sweep everything away off the face of the earth. This is God's house cleaning of the wicked, his house cleaning of unrighteousness. And notice, it's everything on the earth. So the tribulation is a time of universal judgment, not just the Jewish people, but the whole world as well. Well, what is God going to sweep away? Well, his broom will sweep away all kinds of life. In verse 3, I will remove man and beast. I will remove the birds of the sky and the fish of the sea. So quite a number of different types of life are mentioned there. Man, beast, birds, fish. And this is really a reversal of the creation order. It's as though God is rewinding his work. So he'll back up to the starting point, and as he eliminates unrighteousness from the earth. And his broom will also include the sweeping away of stumbling blocks, which is a reference to idols, also in verse 3. And the ruins, literally stumbling blocks, along with the wicked. Now remember, this is a Ne'um Adonai. This is going to happen. So ruins is not the best translation there by the NASB. I think the best translation there is stumbling blocks. And the wicked, along with their stumbling blocks, are going to be removed, because it's the wicked who are responsible for the stumbling blocks. And so they are judged as well. And then he finishes verse 3 with a play on words. He's going to cut off man, Hebrew Adam, from the face of the earth, Hebrew Adamah. So here's the last part of verse 3. I will cut off Adam. I will cut off man from the face of the Adamah, the earth, declares the Lord. So all this emphasizes the tribulation period will be a time of universal judgment. But now God is going to focus his attention on Judah. The chosen people are ripe for judgment. You know, in Romans chapter 2, verse 9, the implication is a very heavy judgment. Remember? Romans 2, verse 9? We don't quote this verse all that often. There will be tribulation and distress for every soul of man who does evil, of the Jew first, and also of the Greek. So we bear special responsibility to be righteous and not to do evil. So with double responsibility, with double blessing, being the chosen people, comes double responsibility. And when double responsibility is, we fail in our double responsibility, we receive double punishment. So the privileged chosen people are also the accountable chosen people. Double punishment if we fail in our responsibility. All right, verses 1 through 3 have been worldwide and universal in scope. Again, now Zephaniah shifts his gaze to the Jewish people and what's happening in his own time. Now the shift will be back to the near future. The near future. This is a short-term prophecy that will authenticate Zephaniah. So the first part of verses 4 through 6 will be fulfilled by the Babylonians in 586, just 44 years after it was uttered, just a few years during possibly during Zephaniah's lifetime, very possibly. And it will authenticate Zephaniah. It will come about exactly as he stated. So God's judgment, God's broom, is going to come across against a number of things. The object of his sweeping with his broom, his judgment, is Judah and Jerusalem in verse 4. So I will stretch out my hand against Judah and against the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So let's take a look at a map of that. Here's Israel after the fall of the northern kingdom. You can see the brown area on the left is indicates provinces of Assyria. The hash-marked area, the striped area on the right, indicates that those countries were influenced by Assyria, but they had a certain amount of autonomy. So this is the province of Judah. Judah was conquered by Assyria. 46 fortified cities were destroyed and attacked by the Assyrians, but the heartland of Judah was not taken. The Assyrians could not take Jerusalem, which of course is the capital of Judah. So Judah is under the vast majority of the province of Judah is under the thumb of Assyria, but the heartland is not. They still remain free and independent of Assyria. But God's judgment is going to come across Judah and Jerusalem for a number of offenses. And 6 offenses are listed starting in verse 4. The first offense is Baalism in verse 4. And I will cut off the remnant of Baal from his place. Baalism. Now, who was this guy? Well, Baal was the storm god and the head of the Canaanite pantheon. You see a little idol on the left. The little picture on the left is an idol. And in the middle, there's a relief of Baal, the storm god. So he was being worshipped by the Jewish people. They had taken up worship of this Canaanite god. And Ashtaroth was one of Baal's wives. They also worshipped his consort, the Ashtaroth. And it's not mentioned here, but Ashtaroth and Asherah were consorts, were wives of Baal. And they were very closely associated with Baal. So they were being worshipped as well. And you can read about these so-called gods in your handouts on page 3 and 4. So the remnant of them will be destroyed. You know, after Josiah's reforms, most of them were destroyed. There may be a little remnant left. God says, I'm going to get rid of them as well. So his first offense, his first judgment comes against Baalism. The second offense is Chemarim, or against the priests. It's against the idolatrous priests in verse 4. And the names of the idolatrous priests along with the priests. So the Chemarim, that means idolatrous priests, they are mentioned in 2 Kings 23:5. He did away with the idolatrous priests whom the kings of Judah had appointed to burn incense in the high places, in the cities of Judah, and in the surrounding area of Jerusalem. So again, you can see these high priests, these idolatrous priests are in the province of Judah and specifically in Jerusalem. And then they are also mentioned in Hosea 10:5. Well, let me finish up 2 Kings 23:5. And those who burned incense to Baal, to the sun and the moon and the constellations and all the host of heavens. And we see here more false worship, more offenses in the face of God. We'll talk about them in just a moment. So the idolatrous priests are also mentioned in Hosea 10:5. The inhabitants of Samaria will fear for the calf of Beth Aven. Indeed, the people will mourn for it, and its idolatrous priests will cry over it, over its glory, since it, the glory, has departed from it. So that's the second offense, idolatrous priests. The third offense is Sabaeanism. This means star worshippers, the host of heaven, in verse 5. And those who bow down on the housetops to the host of heaven. Remember, we just mentioned them a little while ago. So this was strictly forbidden in the law, in the Torah, Deuteronomy 4:19. Beware not to lift up your eyes to heaven and see the sun and the moon and the stars, all the hosts of heaven, and be drawn away and worship them and serve them, those which the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven. So strictly forbidden. But even so, astrology was practiced at this time. And astrology was practiced heavily at this time. And I'm not talking, now note here, I'm not talking about astronomy. I'm talking about astrology, giving power, thinking that some kind of power lies in the heavenly host, and worshiping them is important. That's astrology. I'm not talking about scientific astronomy. Astronomy is simply the scientific study of the heavenly bodies, not the worship of the heavenly bodies, the way astrology is. So astrology was heavily practiced at this time. One example is 2 Kings 21:3-5. For he, and this is speaking of evil King Manasseh, rebuilt the high places which Hezekiah his father had destroyed. And he erected altars to Baal and made an Asherah, there she is, the wife of Baal, as Ahab king of Israel had done, and worshipped all the host of heaven and served them. He built altars in the house of the Lord, right in the what's the word I'm looking for? Right in the house of the Lord, right in the chambers of the house of the Lord, the courts of the Lord. In Jerusalem, of which the Lord had said, in Jerusalem I will put my name. And he built altars for all the hosts of heaven in the two courts of the house of the Lord, probably the court of the women and the court of Israel, or the outer court and the inner court. Don't know exactly what they were, but there were two of them, and idols were set up there and worshipped. The idols, the host of heaven, I should say, were also worshipped on housetops. Now, that's because the houses of the day had flat roofs that allowed for the observation of star worship. Now, here's a typical house of the period. This is drawn by the leading architectural archaeologist of our day, Lean Rittmeyer. So there's kind of a typical house of the period. You can see the flat roof over the first story, and then the second story, the shorter second story, also has a flat roof as well. And then here's another illustration of just the square boxes that the Israelite houses looked like. And you can see in these drawings that we have sleeping mats up on the roofs, because in the hot summer days it would be much cooler to sleep up on the roofs. But that would allow you to observe the stars, and that led to worship of the stars as well. Now, in Biblical Archaeology Review in 2001, these are a few comments about the houses in the Jewish houses of the time. The two-story structure was divided into 3 long rooms by 2 rows of pillars, and a broad room spanned the back of the house. The first floor was given over to animals and to food storage. The inhabitants, probably 3 generations of an extended family, ate, entertained, and slept on the second floor, and possibly on the roof. Yes, very likely on the roof. And Jeremiah refers to this in Jeremiah 19:13 as well. The houses of Jerusalem and the houses of the kings of Judah will be defiled like the place of Tophet, because of all the houses on whose rooftops they burned sacrifices to all the heavenly host and poured out drink offerings to other gods. So Judah and Jerusalem are guilty of all kinds of offenses against God. The fourth offense is syncretism and compromise. Remember what syncretism is? Verse 5. And those who bow down and swear to the Lord and yet swear by Milcom. There's your syncretism. Syncretism is what? It's the reconciliation or union of different or opposing principles, practices, or parties in philosophy or in religion. Syncretism is being practiced. They would worship the god of the Ammonites, Malcham. Jeremiah 49:3. Wail, O Heshbon, for Ai has been destroyed. Cry out, O daughters of Rabbah. Gird yourselves with sackcloth and lament, and rush back and forth on these walls, for Malcham will go into exile together with his priests and his princes. So, God of the surrounding nations. Now you can read about Malcham or Moloch, which is a variation of his name, in your handout on page 5. And here's a drawing of the worship of Moloch, also known as Melech, Malcham, or Moloch, for example. He's thought to be a large brass idol that was heated on the inside by a fire till it was red hot, and then child sacrifice was practiced by placing the child in the hands of Moloch. And of course the child would writhe and scream as the heat killed the child. And how was that covered over? Well, you see the musical instruments at the base of the idol. The men with the drums and the men with the trumpets would blow and play their music so that the screams of the child could not be heard. Just a gruesome, gruesome religion. So it's very sad that the Lord alone was not good enough. They had to call out to Moloch too in this disgusting child sacrifice. So you can see Judah and Jerusalem are ripe for judgment. The fifth offense was the apostates in verse 6, and those who have turned back from following the Lord. The apostates are those who deliberately reject the Lord, who actively turn their back on him, actively rejected him. Offense number 6 is in the next part of verse 6, and those who have not sought the Lord or inquired of him. This is the spiritually indifferent. These are the ones who passively rejected the Lord, just ignored him. You know, they weren't actively rejecting him, but they just were ignoring him passively. Just he didn't mean anything to them. So that's the 6th offense. And God's judgment is going to come across sin and social practices as well in verses 7 through 13. So we begin in verse 7. We jump from the near future in verses 4 through 6, into the far future, the distant future, the tribulation in verses 7 through 18. As we deal with additional offenses to God, he will judge sin and social practices. So the day of the Lord is going to be especially severe on social sins. Social sins. Verse 7. Be silent before the Lord God, for the day of the Lord is near. For the Lord has prepared a sacrifice. He has consecrated his guests. So this is the announcement of the day of the Lord. And the warning there is be silent. The admonition, be silent. No more calling out to the false gods. That's not going to be available to you. Why? Because the day of the Lord is at hand. The great tribulation has come. The day of the Lord is always a title for the great tribulation. Here's a definition of the day of the Lord from the Dictionary of Bible Themes, entry 9220. The day of the Lord is the occasion of God's final intervention in human affairs to punish sin, to restore the faithful of his people, and establish his rule over the nations. It is linked with the messianic hope. It will be fulfilled at Yeshua HaMashiach's return, Jesus the Messiah's return. This future consummation is anticipated in historical acts of judgment, and although its time is unknown, it will be heralded and accompanied by signs and by great upheavals in nature. Be a lot of supernatural stuff happening during the tribulation period, and great upheavals in nature, both on the earth and in the heavens. A study of the tribulation makes that very, very clear. So the Lord has a sacrifice prepared, and the guests are sanctified or consecrated. They are set apart, though. They're set apart for destruction and judgment. Now, who are the guests that are going to be destroyed? First of all, the royal house is going to be judged in verse 8. Then will come about on the day of the Lord's sacrifice that I will punish the princes, the king's sons, and all who clothe themselves in foreign garments. So all strata of society, Jewish society, will be judged, but this is the first group. And it's going to come to pass on the day of the Lord's sacrifice. So that's the tribulation period. And who's going to be judged? The leadership of the nation, the princes and the king's sons. Now the princes and the king's sons, and other rich, I suppose, in Judah and Jerusalem, are characterized by the wearing of foreign apparel. And the rich, the powerful, could afford either imported clothes, or they would go to the surrounding nations and be impressed by the clothes of the surrounding nations. But in contrast to that, God had regulated a dress code. He had regulated a dress code for the Jewish people. And that dress code comes out, first of all, in Numbers 15, verses 38 through 40. Speak to the sons of Israel. Tell them that they shall make for themselves tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and that they shall put on the tassel of each corner a cord of blue. It shall be a tassel for you to look at and remember all the commandments of the Lord, so as to do them, and not follow after your own heart and your own eyes, after which you played the harlot. And so that you may remember to do my commandments and be holy to the Lord your God. And then Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 11 and 12, this dress code is emphasized as well. You shall not wear a material mixed of wool and linen together. You shall make yourselves tassels on the four corners of your garment with which you cover yourself. So these tassels and this clothing was designed by God to help us remember our position as the chosen people and to observe the Mosaic law. And so to ignore the dress code was to violate the Mosaic law. Well, how is this dress code observed today? Well, it's observed today through the wearing of talit and tzitzit. A talit is a prayer shawl. The tzitzit are the tassels on the prayer shawl. Now, the talit originally was just a rectangular outer garment that you threw across your shoulders to protect you from the elements. It was just an outer garment. And it was on this outer garment that the people were to attach these tassels. Now, any other tassels you see on a talit are strictly decorative. The ones that count are the long ones there on the corner. Now, as the talit became less and less an apparel choice among the Jewish people. The rabbis decided to keep it alive by transitioning it from being an outer garment to protect you against the elements to a prayer shawl, a rectangular garment that you threw over your shoulders during prayer. And again, the tassels would remind you of the Lord your God. So here is a rectangular talit with the tzitzit, the tassels on the corner. And here's a picture of Jewish men, Orthodox men, at the Western Wall praying, and you can see most of them are wearing their talit, their prayer shawl. Again, that prayer shawl is not protecting them from the elements, but it is reminding them that they are to obey the law of God. Now, there's also a variation of this practice called the talit katan with tzitzit. This means the small prayer shawl with tassels. For those men that want to wear a prayer shawl all day as a normal piece of apparel, this small talit katan was developed, a rectangular garment. It was placed over the head through that head opening, and you can see the tzitzit, the small tassels at the corners. And so it goes under your garments, and here you can see a Orthodox man wearing his talit katan and tzitzit, and you can see the tzitzit hanging down, the tassels that are to remind him to obey the law of the Lord. The other tassels you see across the front are the decorative tassels that are just part of the talit. The tassels that count are the long ones on the corner. So that's the way this dress code is observed today. So ignoring this dress code was a violation of the Mosaic law, but wearing the foreign clothing also encouraged the mimicking of foreign customs. But what was God's desire for Israel? God's desire for Israel, Exodus 19:5 and 6. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession from among all the peoples, for the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel. So the wearing of this dress code, the obedience to the dress code, was to mark Israel as a distinct people. That's what Leviticus 20:26 emphasizes. Thus you are to be holy to me, set apart. It's the distinct people. For I, the Lord, am holy. I am set apart and distinct. I'm set apart from all sin. And I have set you apart from the peoples to be mine. That's why God instituted the Mosaic law. Deuteronomy 7:6. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people of his own possession out of all the peoples who are in the face of the earth. See, that's a great privilege, to be the chosen people. Deuteronomy 14:2. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you to be a people of his own possession out of all the peoples on the face of the earth. And so the tassels at the corner of our garments were to remind us of that position and to proclaim it to the other nations of the world. But the royal family and the leaders of the nation will be judged for disobedience. But the priesthood is the second group that will be judged as well, in verse 9. And I will punish on that day all who leap on the temple threshold, who fill the house of their Lord with violence and deceit. So the timing is in that day. It's the same day, the day of the Lord. And he talks about those who leap over the threshold. Now this is a difficult translation, and there's a difficult decision here. This could be a reference to an idolatrous practice, such as the priests of Dagon leaping over the threshold in 1 Samuel 5:4 and 5. It could be an idolatrous practice. Or it could be a figure of speech for robbery, leaping over the wall for the purpose of spoiling, robbery. So we don't know exactly what he's talking about there, but whatever it is, it doesn't really matter exactly what it is, but whatever it is, it's being done with violence and deceit, and they're filling their master's house with it. Whatever it is, it's characterized by lies and brutality. But we do know that the priesthood was worshiping pagan deities within the temple just before the Babylonian exile. Now, what we're talking about here takes place during the tribulation. Will this happen again in the tribulation period, in the tribulation temple? Well, we know the temple has to be up again. We know there has to be a tribulation temple. 2 Thessalonians 2:3 and 4 tells us that. Let no one in any way deceive you, for it will not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat where? In the temple of God. This would be the third temple, displaying himself as being God. So we know the third temple has to be up and functioning by the middle of the tribulation period. And there's a lot of pressure in Israel these days to, in fact, get that temple built. Levitical priests, for example, here are being trained to offer the sacrifices in the traditional manner. And so the pressure to rebuild the temple is unrelenting in Israel at this time. And it is going to happen. It will go up. Will there be pagan deities worshipped in the temple compound during the tribulation? Well, it may very well be. Now in verses 10 and 11, the commercial area is taken. This is the third group to be judged, the businessmen. So the timing will be in that day, which will be the prophetic future, the same time frame, the tribulation. Verse 10. On that day, there it is, the tribulation, declares the Lord, there will be a sound of a cry from the fish gate, a wail from the second quarter, a loud crash from the hills. Now these were areas of key commercial activity. And so this area of commercial activity is going to be an area of grief for the businessmen. Now here's ancient Jerusalem of Zephaniah's day approximately. It's the yellow, orange, purple, and red areas. And the Mishnah, or the second quarter, is this area to the north of the city. That's the business area. And the gate, the main gate into the Mishnah, was the fish gate. So that's what Zephaniah is referring to. He knows the geography of Jerusalem. Here's a close-up of that northern area of Jerusalem. Here again is the Mishnah, the business area, and the gate into that business area is called the fish gate. So there will be a disruption of business, a destruction of the business during the tribulation period in Jerusalem, and the businessmen will be grieving. There'll be a great crashing from the hills. That's the noise of destruction that's coming during the day of the Lord. Now, just an interesting side note, point D in your outline mentions that this is also the home, the Mishnah was also the home of Huldah the prophetess in 2 Kings 22:14. She lived in that area. The Maktesh will also be affected by God's broom, God's judgment, in verse 11. Wail, O inhabitants of the mortar, for all the people of Canaan will be silenced. All who weigh out silver will be cut off. Now that word Maktesh literally means mortar, as the NASB has translated it there. And it is apparently another market district. Now here's our previous map. The Maktesh is located in the Tyropoeon Valley. Now the Tyropoeon Valley is the central valley running through the middle of Jerusalem. It's virtually indistinguishable these days. And here is the Maktesh, the mortar, that area of the Tyropoeon Valley. Again, apparently another business area. Why do we think it's a business area? Because it's stated for the people of Canaan. The people there are called Canaanites. Well, it's not a reference there to Canaanite peoples, but to merchants. The term Canaanite was another term for a businessman, a merchant. So the point is that Israel has become a Canaanite. Money is more important than God. Profit, more important. That's their idol. They're laden with silver. Silver is their God. Silver is their object. Profit is what they want, not a relationship with God. So the businessmen of Jerusalem and Judah will be judged as well. And then, in general, there will be a search for sinners in verse 12. It will come about at that time that I will search Jerusalem with lamps, and I will punish the men who are stagnant in spirit, literally settled on their lees, who say in their hearts, the Lord will not do good or evil. So again, the timing is at that time, the tribulation period. It's the day of the Lord, the day of Jacob's trouble. And he's going to search out Jerusalem with lamps. God is going to be like Diogenes of Sinope. Here's a drawing of Diogenes of Sinope. He was a Greek philosopher who became famous for walking around with his lantern. And the people would ask him, why are you walking around in broad daylight with your candle, with your lantern? And he would say, I'm looking for an honest man. And he never found one. So that lamp is a picture of methodical, careful, meticulous, detailed search. And that's the exact same idea behind the Bedikat Chametz ceremony that we practice during Passover, the search for the leaven. And you can see here this young man has got his candle, and he's going to search out every nook and cranny of his house for leaven. Why? Because leaven is a picture of sin, and he wants to remove all sin from his house. So again, that candle there is a picture of a methodical, careful, meticulous, detailed search. And so God is going to do that in regard to men, and nothing is going to be hidden. Nothing is hidden from God. All sin will be exposed. That's one of the first purposes for the tribulation, to make an end to wickedness and wicked ones. And here, of course, it's Jewish sinners. And we often quote Romans 1:16. I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. And that's a great privilege, to have salvation designed to go out to the Jewish people first, to go out to us first, because we're God's chosen people. But we often forget Romans 2:9. Remember I quoted this earlier? There will be tribulation and distress for every soul of man who does evil, of the Jew first, and also the Greek. And that's the problem with the tribulation. The Jewish people will suffer tremendously under the tribulation as God makes an end to wickedness and wicked ones. Not only will the whole world suffer, but the Jewish people in particular. He's going to punish the men settled on their lees. Now this is a reference to the residue of winemaking. Lees is the solid matter that settles at the bottom after fermentation. It thickens the wine, and if the wine remains too long in the lees, it becomes syrupy and bitter, and it must be discarded. So Judah is settled down on its dregs and impurities in the tribulation period. So Judah is spiritually, morally, thick and syrupy, filled with sin. We are bitter, we're impure in God's mouth. We must be thrown out. And the result? They linger over the dregs and say in their hearts, the Lord does neither good or evil. They're either atheistic or complacent in their sin. And so the patience of God is being mistaken for indifference, either indifference or a lack of power or an unwillingness to bring justice. The Lord will do neither good nor evil. We can sin and get away with it. Well, what's the results of that kind of an attitude? Verse 13. Moreover, their wealth will become plunder, their houses desolate. Yes, they will build houses and not inhabit them, and plant vineyards but not drink their wine. So during the tribulation period, the land of Israel will become economically and physically devastated. The wealth will become spoil, become plunder for the armies of the Antichrist. The houses desolated. They'll become a devastation. The houses will become a devastation by the violence of war. And if they build houses, others will live in them. Those houses that survive will be billeted by the armies of the Antichrist. The soldiers will live in them as they invade Israel. Their crops, they'll plant vineyards, but the armies of the Antichrist will enjoy them. They will not enjoy them. And this is not a new statement. Amos in chapter 5, verse 11 made the same statement. In Amos 5:11 he said, Therefore, because you impose heavy rent on the poor and exact tribute of grain from them, though you have built houses of well-hewn stone, yet you will not live in them. You have planted pleasant vineyards, yet you will not drink their wine. Nothing new. This happened before. This happened when Assyria destroyed the northern kingdom. The same curse came upon the northern kingdom. This is nothing new in Jewish history. So in verses 14 through 18, we have another graphic description of the tribulation period, the day of the Lord. Verse 14. He repeats verse 7 basically. Near is the great day of the Lord, near and coming very quickly. Listen, the day of the Lord. In it, the warrior cries out bitterly. Remember, what is the day of the Lord? It's the occasion of God's final intervention in human affairs to punish sin, restore the faithful of his people, and establish his rule over the nations. It is linked with the Messianic hope. It'll be fulfilled at Yeshua HaMashiach's return. This future consummation is anticipated in historical acts of judgment. And although its time is unknown, it will be heralded and accompanied by signs and great upheavals in nature. The day of the Lord, the tribulation period. It's soon to come. And so the people of God are to live in a state of constant anticipation. You and I, in the 21st century, are to live in a state of anticipation as well. And notice the description. It's a day of bitterness. The word means terror and resentment and cynicism. It's a day when the soldiers shout. So even the brave soldiers are terrified. In verse 15, it's a day of divine judgment. A day of wrath is that day. A day of trouble and distress. A day of destruction and desolation. A day of darkness and gloom. A day of clouds and thick darkness. Pretty gruesome description, isn't it? A day of wrath. That means it's a day characterized by overflowing rage and fury. It's a day of trouble. A day of affliction and adversity. It's a day of distress. That means a day with great external pressures and stress upon people. It's a day of anguish, a day of great misery. It's a day of desolation. Everything will be wasted. It's a day of ruin. Everything is wasted and destroyed. And then a day of darkness, gloom, and clouds. The darkness and dimness and obscurity will be both literal and spiritual during the day of the Lord. Very, very gruesome time. And finally, it's a day of darkness, thick darkness. The Hebrew word describes a darkness so deep that it veils the glory of God. This is God's cloak, and it will cloak the world physically and literally during the tribulation period. In verse 16, it's a day of war. It's a day of trumpet and battle cry against the fortified cities and the high corner towers. Now, the tribulation will be characterized by 3 world wars. The third world war being the campaign of Armageddon, which in turn consists of 3 battles. So here's a quick overview of the campaign of Armageddon, the last world war of the tribulation period. It begins with the Antichrist assembling his armies at Armageddon, at Har Megiddo. Har Megiddo is the Jezreel Valley. All the nations of the world, this is why it's World War III, will assemble men and materiel in the Jezreel Valley. Now, Babylon will be the Antichrist's religious, political, and economic capital of the world, and the Antichrist will leave Babylon, his capital, and join his troops. He will join his troops at Har Megiddo. That will be where his command center is located. Then comes the destruction of Babylon. This is the first battle of the campaign of Armageddon. We learn in Jeremiah 51, verses 27 and 28, that the kingdoms of Ararat and Beni, off on the right there, and Ashkenaz, way off the map on the left, will all join forces. They'll join forces with the Medes, and they'll come against Babylon with a surprise attack. Their attack will be very successful. Babylon will be destroyed in the manner in which the Bible demands, totally and quickly, swiftly obliterated. This brings us to the 4th stage of the campaign of Armageddon, the fall of Jerusalem. This is the second battle of this worldwide war. But by worldwide, again, I mean all the armies of the world are gathered together in the Jezreel Valley. Everybody is supplying soldiers and weapons to come against the Jewish people. The Antichrist will not protect his capital. He will move south to Jerusalem in order to take her, and a horrendous battle will occur, but Jerusalem will finally fall. This brings us to the 5th stage of the campaign. The tribulation Holocaust begins. This is the middle of the tribulation, and the Jewish flight to Basra. When Jerusalem falls, then the Jewish people who have survived will flee to a place of refuge. That place of refuge, that city of refuge, will be Basra, also known as Petra today. The armies of the Antichrist will continue the battle. They will move south to besiege Basra. So he doesn't want the Jewish people to get away. He sends his armies down to Basra to besiege the city. Now, the Jewish people will be scattered all over the world during this time frame, but the most important group of Jewish people will be located in Basra, probably the leadership of the nation located in Basra. That brings us to the 7th stage of the campaign, the national regeneration of Israel. The Jewish people realize that Yeshua will be our Savior, and we begin to call out to Him. We place our faith in Him in the last 3 days of the tribulation and begin to call out to Him to return. Baruch haba Hashem Adonai. And he responds to our call with the second coming of the Messiah. Yeshua responds. He returns. He rises from his throne at the right hand of God, and he returns to save his people. And the initial point of the return will be Basra in Edom, in southern Jordan. This brings on the 9th stage of the campaign, which is the Messiah treading the winepress. This is the third battle of the campaign of Armageddon. The field of battle is outlined for us in Joel chapter 2, verse 20. And Yeshua will march from Basra and Taman, the area of Taman, into the wilderness of Paran, and then into the Negev, turning north, destroying the armies of the Antichrist to the east and to the west, and finally arriving at Jerusalem from the south. This is the winepress of the wrath of God Almighty. The battle will end with the end of the fighting in the Valley of Jehoshaphat. Now, some people feel that the Valley of Jehoshaphat is the Kidron Valley here. I don't necessarily think so, but whether it is or not, Yeshua will march up the Kidron Valley to the base of the Mount of Olives, and he'll do a victory ascent up the Mount of Olives. This is the lower slopes of the Mount of Olives right here, and he performs a victory ascent up the Mount of Olives, and the campaign of Armageddon comes to a close. If you're interested in more details regarding this view of the campaign of Armageddon, I would highly recommend that you pick up Footsteps of the Messiah by Dr. Arnold G. Fruchtenbaum, available on Ariel Ministries Press and from Amazon.com. You'll get more details than I'm able to present to you here during this study of Zephaniah. All right, so it's a day of war. The day of the Lord will be a day of war. It'll also be a day of judgment against sinners. Now, verses 17 and 18 are worldwide in scope. I will bring distress on men, so that they will walk like the blind, because they have sinned against the Lord, and their blood will be poured out like dust, and their flesh like dung. So the threat, God is going to bring distress against the people. This is the Hebrew term, a general term for all humanity. So he's talking about all humanity here. And the reason, they have sinned against the Lord. All mankind is responsible to worship the Lord. We learn in Romans 1, 2, and 3. And all mankind, except for those who place their faith in Yeshua, will have turned their back on the Lord and be actively worshiping the Antichrist at this time. But the result of that choice will be death, the death penalty. Their blood will be poured out like dust, their entrails like filth or dung, a rather explicit and vivid description of the destruction that's going to come upon the Antichrist's armies. And at that time, their wealth will not be able to save them during the day of the Lord's wrath. People put their trust in money. And we see this in verse 18. Neither their silver nor their gold will be able to deliver them on the day of the Lord's wrath. And all the earth will be devoured in the fire of his jealousy. So the scope here again is worldwide. The entire earth is in view. For he will make a complete end, indeed a terrifying one, of all the inhabitants of the earth. Repeated twice in Zephaniah 1:18. So the earth will be consumed, and all who live on the earth. Not only does this refer to the land of Israel, not only is the land of Israel judged, but the entire planet will be judged. And that is bad news. That is bad news. But in the midst of the bad news comes good news, that God will extend mercy for the sake of Israel. Matthew 24:22, Mark 13:20. Yeshua says, unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. For the sake of Israel and for the sake of those Gentiles who become believers in Yeshua during the tribulation period, he's going to bring the tribulation period to an end before everybody is destroyed. So most of chapter 1 has dealt with the tribulation period. Now we've arrived at chapter 2. And in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, he's going to shift his attention to an event that must come to pass before the day of the Lord. So here's our time frames. We were in the tribulation period. Now we're going to jump back just one time frame to this time frame that I call the first regathering in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. And we'll pick that up next week. We'll pick that up next session as we continue our study in the book of Zephaniah. Chapter 2 will be our object next session. So I hope you'll be able to join us. Thanks so much for being a student in this session. Please join us for the next session as we get into chapter 2 of Zephaniah. Thanks for being a student. Lehi Throat. Lehi Throat.